or the interpretation of artworks. Can this be actually bad to teach scientific thinking? Well, and I think yes, it can be, but it depends how it is done. I would like to explain this, and I would like to start off with a little example. Maybe you know Douglas Adams, the author Douglas Adams, who's written the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And in this one scene, very famous scene, there is this supercomputer, and this supercomputer was asked, what is the meaning of life and the universe and everything? And after a long calculation time, the computer responded with an answer, and the answer was 42. Right? And ever since from that point onward, the number 42, this has become a little bit like a running joke inside the computer community and science community. That's basically a humorous event that was described in the book. But there were actually folks out there who tried to really analyze why exactly 42? What's so special about 42? Why did Douglas Adams, the author, choose 42? And they came up with all sorts of explanations, really. It goes even back into old Tibetan mythology. There was some kind of a connection there, or base 13 number system, or binary numbers, and so on. You have people actually found an explanation of why Douglas Adams used the number 42 and the deeper meaning of 42. Well, why not ask the author himself? And actually, he was interviewed exactly about that. And this is what the author responded. A quote now. The answer to this is very simple. It was a joke. It had to be a number, an ordinary smallish number, and I chose that one. Binary representations, base 13, Tibetan monks are all complete nonsense. I sat at my desk, I stared into the garden and thought, 42 will do. I typed it out, end of story. So there was actually nothing behind it, and the philosophical point of this episode was actually quite different. And the philosophical point is known because it's actually written in the story, Hitchhiker's Guide. It's like this is, the computer was asked why 42, and then basically the computer responded something like, well, maybe the question was wrong. You have to know what you're asking for. If you want to get the correct answer, if you want to get a good answer, you have to make sure that the question is right. So this was the philosophical point, and people went off and trying to analyze what does 42 mean. That's a very, I would say, humorous maybe episode, but honestly, it starts to become a little bit less fun if you're actually sitting in school like I did many, many years ago, and when you're given a poem and you are required to analyze a poem. And as a matter of fact, now I brought along the poem that I read many years ago, and I just want to read out the first couple of lines. The poem was written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it's a fairly long poem. I'm just going to read together with you the first couple of lines. Kubla Khan in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and here were gardens bright with sinuous rills, and so on, and so on, and so on. It goes on, it goes on, it goes on. Honestly, at that time I did not understand. I did not understand the poem, and I still don't understand it. We had to analyze it. Right? What could it have meant? What does it mean? And so on, and so on. You can write essays about it. And then my English teacher told us, well, actually what he did is the poet, he took opium drugs, right? And then he started to sleep, and he started to hallucinate and to dream. And then when he woke up, he wrote down the poem because that's what he kind of dreamt. I felt so upset about that. I mean, how can you analyze, honestly, poetry which evidently, at least to my view at that time, didn't actually even make sense, because the guy was just dreaming it, right? There was no intent to write it in a particular way. He just wrote it down, and it's a form of creative artistic expression. Nothing against that. Nothing against that. But where I feel critical a little bit now is also as having some scientific training as well, and being a science teacher, I feel critical about analyzing things where there is actually no data there. Because what's going to happen is that you start to inject meaning into something that actually does not have meaning. And I consider that to be harmful for scientific thinking. Right? So it's a little bit like the 42. I mean, there was no meaning, deeper meaning behind it. And there is no point in trying to interpret these things now in such a way as if it had meaning, because it wasn't even the original intent of the author. right? And same over here, the guy just wrote the poem because it was he dreamt something, he wanted to document his dreams. It was a form of a creative, artistic self-expression, which is important. Yeah, but then just leave it as it is, leave the poem as it is, and don't take another step and inject meaning into something where there is no meaning. You see, of course, we also interpret data in the sciences. I mean, it's a very central and critical part. You collect measurement data, you've got your numbers, you measure something, you got your numbers, and then you start to interpret it to give those values meaning. And the purpose of interpreting the data is to make the data more valuable. So we remove outliers, we reduce the noise. We question whether the data is representative or not of a larger data set. So we are basically interpreting it based on the available evidence and on the available data. And you should do the same thing also in poetry and in arts if you want to do that. You basically take the original intent of the author or the text that you have, and then based on that, you try to understand the poem better. What was the intention of the author? That's my view. Okay, I know that there are folks out there who have different views about this, but I see it very critical if you now try to inject meaning into the poem, which might not even be the original intention of the author. I mean, if I were to create artwork, right, and somebody else in 50, 100 years were to analyze my artwork and then basically tell me, long dead already, tell me of what actually I meant when I wrote this artwork and this poem, I mean, I would feel offended, right? So don't analyze it then, right? But if the person in 100, 200 years would like to understand a little bit my context better and why I wrote the poem the way I wrote it, well, then that's of course a little more meaningful. But you should really be careful not to basically then inject meaning and interpret something into the poem which actually wasn't even the intention of the author, right? So that's basically also something that luckily I think a good literary analysis does. That's why you have to provide evidence. That's why we teach students. I'm not an English teacher, okay? I'm a science teacher, but from my experience, we always had to provide evidence. You had to quote from the poem, from the book, and to provide evidence for your point. But here you also have to be a little bit careful because you could, of course, also do it the way that I did it. What I've done is in the past, I have to write an essay about a certain poem. I read the poem, more or less tried to understand it, and then I projected what the author actually meant, right? Didn't just read it, the author means that, right? I already knew that. After 10 minutes of reading the artwork, I already knew what the author actually intended, and then I cherry-picked evidence out of the poem to support my claim. And that's bad. You don't do that in the sciences. It's really important. You have to start from the data first, and then you extrapolate meaning, not the other way around. Yeah? You don't formulate a theory first, and then try to find evidence to support that theory, right? So it's really important that you keep those things apart. In the sciences, data first, then interpretation. And definitely not a thesis first, theory first, or interpretation first, and then cherry picking the evidence. Yeah, you don't do that. Yeah, I have to tell you there is actually I think the worst example of this is actually not from literature, but actually from visual arts. Vincent van Gogh has made this very famous painting called Starry Night. And he actually painted the night sky with a couple of stars there. It's a very, actually nice painting. I think you can find it on many postcards. Honestly, I've read essays, really page-long essays, where astronomers tried to identify which stars he actually painted. Yeah, is it Venus now, the planet Venus, or are there some other stars? Yeah, not Venus being a planet, and then stars, of course, in the sky. Could it be? What could this actually mean? And the brightest object, well, that must be Venus. But that's beside the point, right? You don't. There's no why interpret it like this. The painting is a form of an emotional expression of what he felt, and I think it should not be interpreted in such a way, right? Otherwise, if you keep on doing that, if we force students or people to interpret things where there is nothing to be interpreted, then essentially you're teaching an attitude, anything goes, right? Any data that I've got, I can interpret it in whatever way I want. Anything goes, right? Because ultimately, it's up to me to decide what the author or the artist meant, or what the scientist essentially meant. Yeah, it's up to me. I can interpret it whatever way I want. This doesn't work like that in the sciences. Yeah, you can't do that, right? And so, what I'm in summary, can now interpretation be harmful for teaching scientific thinking? And I'm saying yes, If it is done in such a way that you first have a thesis, a statement, and cherry picking the data, and if you're injecting meaning into something where there is no meaning, and where there was no intent of the creator of the artwork. It might be good for training scientific thinking if you take the poem that you've got, right, and then you analyze the poem and then trying to understand better why the author wrote it the way that he or she wrote it. Okay, then we understand the author better, the incentives of the author better, the context, the historic context better. I think that is an acceptable way, but not the other way around. I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.